I'll say a little bit about the history of sensory evaluation of foods, and something about the immediate past history of the sensory evaluation of foods. Those of you who've had Food Science and Technology 1 will recognize the Amerine idea that there is nothing new in the world, that we've just developed things and moved things along. As soon as man got a hold of fire, he undoubtedly tried to change his food for flavor reasons. He may have even done it earlier than the Paleolithic period. He may have, because we have some cave drawings that show man looking for honey and driving the bees out of a honey comb. So that may have meant that he was looking for something sweet. And I think probably he also, even in the Garden of Eden, I'm not sure it was an apple. Primitive apples are not very good. I'm much more inclined to believe that it was something real sweet, like a peach or something that Eve offered to Adam. Apples, I don't think, would have attracted Adam that much. That's facetious, of course. In the Neolithic period, of course, then man began to change his diet remarkably, and sensory evaluation became very important. How did the housewife determine that she was going to bake bread or make beer and something? She had to give it to her family. So the family constitutes the first sensory evaluation group that we have. And it remained the most important sensory evaluation group right up until the 20th century. The large part of the food was home prepared in the 19th century. The family unit constituted a sensory panel. They said they liked or did not like the foods, and so forth. And the mother then, or whoever was cooking, changed the foods to conform to the kinds of foods that the family liked. If she cooked the cake with one recipe and they didn't like it, then she changed to another recipe, and so forth. So the family unit constituted a very important instant feedback on food quality. And it's not pertinent to this particular course, except secondarily. It also accounts for the fact that most foods that were commercially prepared were prepared very near to the place where the consumers were. We had over 50 breweries in California at one time. They all sold in little local areas. The Buffalo Brewery in Sacramento, for example, and one up at Red Bluff, and one over at Santa Rosa, and one at Stockton, and one at Fresno. These little breweries had mainly a local clientele. If they got a bad brew, the people had an instant feedback to the brewery, and they told them they wanted the beer to be better than that. That disappeared in the 20th century. The breweries are frequently thousands of miles from the place where the beer is being consumed, and there is not very much feedback. And that led then, at the time of World War II, to the question of how can we get some evaluation of foods before we find out that we've lost all of our trade. And that's the immediate predecessor for the present sensory evaluation. There was a little bit earlier, the milk industry had been doing some of this. Milk producers had been interested in quality since about 1890. They had developed a scorecard in the milk producers. We had 92 grade, 93, 4, 5 grade milk in various places in the country, and we even had, even in my time, we had milk contest, and we had a Davis team in 1931 that was not quite the United States champion, but we had the individual championship that year. We went to St. Louis and judged milk. I didn't go, but one of my classmates did. And we were very proud of our milk team. That was something to be on the milk team. It was almost as good as being on the animal judging team, and much better than being on the tree judging team. That was sort of the lowest thing you could be in Davis in those days. Well, at any rate, before World War II, what we had was some milk experts, and we had some milk contests. We had tea tasters. We had some wine tasters in wineries, and I could give you a whole lecture on wine tasting in the 19th century, the early 20th century. But these all operated in a more or less rarefied atmosphere. They were experts by virtue of being self-concentrated. or consecrated, I guess is the word I want to use. They based their reputation on experience. Some of them were obviously very good. Some of them were probably not very good. Since they had an instant feedback from their audience, maybe they didn't have to be as good as modern sensory evaluation people have to be. There were a few companies that had some rather primitive forms of sensory evaluation, but there was no really great push in this until World War II. In World War II, the Quartermaster Corps, which serviced in a research way both the Army and the Navy, the Air Force at that time being a part of the Army, set up in Chicago a large laboratory called the Quartermaster Laboratories. And they were concerned about, first of all, that the diets be nutritious, that everybody get enough of the right kinds of things, and that they get things they would eat. And very early in the World War II, they found that they were issuing foods which were not being consumed. They were issuing large amounts of food were not being consumed. And they began to suspect that, although they knew that some of this was based on food habits, you couldn't expect a Boston Brahmin to go down to Alabama and eat hominy grits and salt pork and fat beans with the fat salt pork. He'd starve to death before he'd eat that sort of thing. They knew that was one thing, but they also had an idea that maybe some of these things that were not being eaten because of the sensory responses. And so out of that, they began to develop in the Quartermaster Laboratories a large amount of panel studies on sensory difference testing. The entire original approach at the Quartermaster Laboratory in the early days was to find differences. Now, like everything, as I said at the beginning of this, there's nothing new in the world. There had been some indications of this even before the war. The Hiram Walker Whiskey Company, for example, had hired an Ohio State psychologist to help them develop a test for telling the difference between blends of whiskey. We'll meet that up a little bit later in the duo-trio system. A Swedish brewery had hired a statistician to develop a system of detecting differences in malting rates of beer. And that developed into the triangular taste test, which was then later taken up in Denmark and arrived in this country sometime after World War II. These two were strictly difference tests. The paired test had been used by Mrs. Cover down in Texas as early as 1936, and it was absorbed into the Quartermaster Corps. The Quartermaster was using all of these during the war for detecting differences in processed foods, one kind of canned corn against another one. They were particularly interested in differences in dehydrated foods because they had no experience in dehydrated foods. They were all being developed all over the country. Some of them were awful. There's nothing that can describe the awful flavor of reconstituted eggs in the early part of dried eggs in the early part of World War II. First of all, I was unfortunate enough to be stationed in a hot climate, India, and they had to ship them through the tropics, and they had no idea how to get dehydrated eggs to the tropics in any kind of condition. So sometimes you just opened the can and then you put the lid back on it and sent it away. They never learned how, in my opinion, to dehydrate cabbage. But the Quartermaster was on this problem. Dr. Stewart in our department, Professor Murack, former Chancellor Murack, both worked almost the whole time during World War II on trying to improve the quality of dehydrated foods, and they were dependent upon Quartermaster to tell them what the differences were. Developed into a whole empire in Chicago. There were chiefs, sub-chiefs, and they had 1,800 people on call by just pressing a button. 1,800 soldiers came running, and they had testing all these dehydrated eggs one day, and the next day they were testing different kinds of dehydrated milk, and the next day they'd be testing dehydrated onions. They were pretty good on onions. I must say that the onions were pretty good. You could do something with them. If you had a mixing machine, as we did because I was in a laboratory company, and you could whirl them at high enough speeds, the dehydrated potatoes weren't bad. You could make something out of them. But the other things, it was impossible. It's much better to have a garden, I think, in some cases. Well, anyway, I've said in the second line of your outline that was the triumph of difference testing. Everybody was immediately convinced that difference testing was the way to run the food industries. Baking companies adapted them, canning companies adapted them, supermarkets adapted them, and even here at the University of California, we developed a tasting laboratory upstairs here. The Enology department had done some little work before the war with this, but nothing in a very systematic way. We had to have a tasting laboratory like everybody else, and even as early as 1948 we had run some applications of triangular taste testing to wine problems and so forth. And from that came this course. Directly on Chancellor Marak's experience in Quartermaster Corps, he came knocking one day and said, we've got to have some sort of course in sensory evaluation. And so we started to develop this material, which eventually appeared in the textbook for this class. And many other universities have developed courses of similar kinds. Well, I think I've given you enough of the background of this course now. I want to emphasize the unsolved problems today. And I will have quite a number of additions to the unsolved problems that we are going to talk about. These are all problems that are soluble by some form of sensory evaluation, that all need immediate attention, and many of them are getting attention, but none of them, to my personal belief, have been completely solved. First of all, there is the whole problem of industry and waste disposal odors. That problem sometimes is very temporary, very seasonal. The basic vegetable products company down at Vacaville have a big problem because about 10 or 11 days of the year, when the wind is right and they're dehydrating onions, it comes up here. Now they have an odor problem to locate the directions of the odor, to find out by sniffing tests or various kinds of tests. They also need to have tests by which they could neutralize the odor by some masking situation, or they may have to remove the odors eventually as an environmental impact on the whole community here. And somebody will have to go out and make the test to do that sort of thing. Waste disposal problems are a major problem in the wine industry and a good many other industries. But just think of the beef that you might be having today at lunch if you weren't in a period of no meat. Anybody ever been around a feedlot where there are animals being fed? Well, just going south from here to Modesto, you go by Manteca. About 2 miles before you get to Manteca, a mile in Manteca, and 2 miles on the other side of Manteca, you have to hold your nose. That's a big place where they're fattening cattle on sugar beet residues. Very lucrative proposition, but creating one of the worst waste disposal problems in Northern California. And if it weren't the largest industry in that community, I'm sure it would long since have been disposed of. The enhancing of normal odors in foods is a major problem, and we have to have very accurate methods for determining what the normal odor is, and then how to enhance it, and in addition to that, whether it's desirable to enhance it or not. Some sort of hedonic test or quality test. We have all kinds of packaging and storage problems on odors that have been worked on, new techniques, very sensitive techniques in some cases. How do you know that the package that you've got your grapes is creating some problem in the grapes themselves? Well, you have to get set up some panels and get some odor tests and so forth. The preservative problem is with us in a big way right now, and is going to be with us for a long time. The overuse of chlorine in food plants is quite well known. The quaternary ammonium overuse is not so serious from the odor problem as the chlorine is. The sulfites, or sulfurous acid compounds, is a major problem and is becoming more major as the limits are being set on this. It, for example, affects all our dehydrated foods. Potatoes have sulfites in them. What level of sulfites can you tolerate? How much do they reduce the quality? And then from the food science point of view, how much do they reduce the thiamine content? Benzoic acid is still a problem, and sorbic acid is a big problem. And sorbic acid represents one of the major problems of sensory evaluation, which Mrs. Pangborn and I have been struggling with now for 15 years, I guess, that everybody's not the same. We know, for example, with sorbic acid that you have a few people over here who have a threshold of 45 milligrams per liter of sorbic acid. And we don't know how big that population is, but just using the department personnel and so forth, it looks like it might be anywhere from 10 to 25% of the population. The rest of the population have an odor threshold of 200 milligrams per liter. Now, in spite of the fact that that was all published from data that Mr. O and I collected 12 years ago, there's a very important, very long article in the German literature just now recommending that sorbic acid be applied to all of the high-quality wines of Germany. Look what's going to happen to 25% of their customers when they do that. 25% of the people are going to reject those wines because they can detect sorbic acid at very low levels. The man only used 10 people, and he was led astray. He just happened to get 10 people on his panel that all had normal sensitivities. Very easy to do. You can calculate the odds of if only 10% of them were. Not very hard to find 10 people that are going to have high thresholds and miss even one of the low threshold people. And we've had that experience throughout here, so we're very sensitive to that problem now. So you have to have larger panels when you're going to do this. If anybody is going to do any predicting about thresholds, you've got to use balanced panels and larger panels, and you can be led astray, as the whole German wine industry is going to be led astray right now. They have another antiseptic they can't use anymore. It's just been banned in the last few weeks. Diethyl pyrocarbonate is not important, the name. And so they're all going to go to sorbic acid now. And they'll have to go to sorbic acid if they're going to make wines the way they've been making. And they think that this is going to be all right. But it won't be all right because they're going to find that some percentage of the population that's going to reject them. It smells like geraniums to the people that are sensitive. And who wants to drink geranium wines? I don't care about geranium wines anyway. All right, what is flavor is another problem. We know it's important from the amount of advertising that goes on it and so forth. The flavor profile, a method that Ms. Pangborn will be demonstrating for you later on, implies that there is such a thing as flavor, has a special technique for identifying it as flavor. We say that we have flavor additives, things that bring out the flavor, glutamates, accent, and so forth. How much do they really bring out the flavor is a problem. We've had some experience with that. We think we know part of the answer. But do they also lead to secondary effects? The Chinese restaurant effect of having too much glutamates. And at least in my barbecue friends, there is a definite prejudice against the overuse of accent. And I think Miss Paul in food science was an enemy of glutamates. She could see glutamates right around the corner sometimes when she was in her food preparation courses. How does production practices affect quality? Most canneries have some sort of quality control, but in many cases they don't have any overall supervision of the flavor aspects. They just have a quality control that the color is always going to be the same, or that the salt content is going to be the same, or in the case of making blends that it's going to be just like the last blend. But the influence of very subtle differences in processing on texture, and which is a part of flavor, and taste and odor, which are the other parts of flavor, are important aspects. Procedures for perishables. We have very poor techniques for perishables. The Western Regional Laboratory has a whole section on sensory evaluation of perishables, and they found that the only way they could get comparable samples was storing them at -10 centigrade. And even then, over long periods of time in storage experiments, they were getting some changes. You got to have something to compare with them. They were storing frozen peas at different temperatures and different humidities and different oxygen contents and so forth. This is a very important problem for a supermarket. How long can we keep frozen peas? How long can the housewife keep frozen peas? And so they worked out sensory methods for doing this, but the procedures are still not very satisfactory, even with all the work they've done. we don't have very much. The last lecture in this course will be on the relationship between the composition of a food chemically and physically and sensory response. That's what we'd like to have. We all agree that sensory examination is rather expensive sort of thing. And we would like to have more tests that are correlated between each other. But the correlations are not very good. The response to a pure compound is not the same as the response in a orange juice or in tomato juice and so forth. And we don't have very good correlations, even where we know all of the constituents or most of the constituents. But we're still looking. There's a new paper out I've just reviewed from Germany, in which they have searched for all the different variables in beer by gas liquid chromatography. Then they've correlated these values with sensory response, and they've divided beers up into 3 categories based on something like 12 important constituents of beer, and they've had some fair success in predicting beer quality from the presence of 12 pure compounds in beer at different amounts. One of our colleagues in food science down in Georgia has been working on that for beer, for coffee. And the Coca-Cola company, which owns a coffee company now, has been doing quite a bit of work on that. Coffee turns out to be more complicated than beer, surprisingly enough. Perhaps as many as 33 different pure compounds will be indicated to compare with quality. Well, let's see, some others. Another problem that we have is that we find the results every place. A lot of them are in medicine, the results that affect sensory evaluation. After all, human beings are the measuring media, and so we have to find out what affects the human beings, and that involves the physiology and various kinds of things. In addition to that, we need to know some of the psychology. I'll be giving a whole lecture on the psychology of the results. I would take out of the thing poor communication between workers. I don't think that's any longer true. We've had several big symposiums since this book was written, 4 of them I believe now. I'll be lecturing on the literature next time. The first part of next lecture will be on the literature, so that I won't go into that any further today. There is still some needs to standardize methodology, but I believe that situation has improved since our text was written. That although we still find papers that we don't think have the best methodology, by and large most people are not using the methods too badly. All right, now I want to talk about the senses related to food habits. One of the important things about the senses, and I'll be lecturing just about the senses next time, is that they have very strong reinforcer values. You give a child a candy bar, and he'll jump through burning hoops for you. Give a dog or a rat, same thing. Animals. And likewise, you give them things that they don't like, and they will cry and reject and won't do anything that you want. So that in general in psychology, we found that the senses can be used to reinforce clues. We want the rat to push a certain button. Every time he pushes that button, we give him a drop of sweet water. That reinforces his desire for more sweet water, and he will then press that button again, and pretty soon he'll just sit on the button until you get it. He drinks up all the sweet water that you have. Rats are rather smart, and children do the same sort of thing, of course. This means that that once people find food that they like, they will do quite a bit to get more of that food. They'll starve, for one thing. People that live on budgets, as I do, and most of you do, I suspect, will save money out from buying a magazine or buying a book in order to have the, I don't know whether there's any chocolate milkshakes worth drinking in Davis or not. I think there's one place downtown that may have at least passable chocolate milkshakes, but I used to think that a good chocolate milkshake made out of milk was worth walking a long ways to, especially if you use chocolate ice cream and good chocolate. I've come to the conclusion that's pretty hard to find nowadays. Well, now this next material is all tangential to the course, but we are keeping the material in it because we think that it has to do with the operational things, how we use panels. That when you get a panel of people to working in sensory evaluation, suppose you're working on peaches and you want to find out the effect of some insecticides on peaches and so forth. Those people come to you with all their built-in physiological and psychological problems. And this part of the course here now, this next part of the lecture, has to do with emphasizing some of those things that influence people's response to foods. Although not in any situation can I say that it really would change the sensory evaluation. It's useful for you to know that some things happen to human beings that change their response to foods. There are some good references in this part. I will not give you any of the references now. I recommend particularly the papers of Sam Lipkowski, our colleague from Berkeley, who has studied this, what makes people eat things and the importance of flavor and so forth in a rather detailed way. First of all, there are some things what we call metabolic state interactions, that is between what you're eating and what you're responding to. For example, you could have a nutritional deficiency that leads to a metabolic state, that is, it leads to a condition in your mind or in your body that makes you want to consume a lot of something. And one of the cases of that is when the adrenal gland has been taken out. The adrenal gland in the human beings is what controls salt intake. You remove the adrenal gland and the body has no way of controlling salt intake, and people will eat salt by the teaspoons. Eat salt by the teaspoon. So if you had a cancer or you had your adrenal gland out because of an accident or something like that, then you would be one of those people that would eat salt almost ad lib in trying to balance your salt intake into the body. And that would be interesting to know if you had a panel that somebody had no adrenal gland or not. And you would be running, in talking about panels, we will point out that you have to give some preliminary tests to your panels to find out if you've got some abnormal people of this kind. You could have nutritional deficiency, which led to some metabolic defect, which led people to want to consume a lot of food in order to rectify the defect. For example, people that have vitamin B deficiency. People that have vitamin B deficiency will reject sugars, but they'll eat anything that's oily and fatty, hoping to get some vitamin B in that way, and realizing that many sweet things have very little vitamin B content, particularly B1. This may or may not be important to anybody. And then finally there is the case where the taste may modify the metabolic mixture, that is the foods that you consume, that's what we mean by metabolic mixture, and lead to some sort of adaptation which would predispose you to disease. You might stop eating tomatoes, or you might stop eating things that contain ascorbic acid. People get into these kind of things where they just don't like something. They've decided they don't like tomato flavor. Maybe some allergy comes along and causes them to dislike it, and so then they suffer. Their metabolic mixture is changed, their food supply is changed, and they eventually run into a deficiency, and then they get sick and so forth. Well, nutrition can change the sensory response in certain definite ways, and this is an interesting subject that needs a lot more investigation, because as I'll point out next time, we really don't know what it is that's triggering off the sense organs. In the case of the nerves, the sense organs are always nerves. What is it that triggers them off? What is it that makes them go and say, this is sweet, so forth? Now, on sweetness, we're making some progress, as Ms. Pangborn will tell you a week from Thursday. But on some of the other things, we don't know anything more now than we did at the end of the 19th century as to what the triggering mechanism is, and so forth. But the chemical deficiency nutritional change could do certain things. One of the things it could do, for example, it could change the blood composition. The blood composition that would then be reflected in changing the environment for the sensory reactor, the nerve that's triggering off the sweet taste and so forth. So that you might get a change in people's sense of sweet taste because of some change in blood composition, which came in turn from some nutritional change that the human being had gone. It's also been postulated that you could get reflexes from other tissues. It might not affect the actual tissue around the bud cell or the nerve for taste in your mouth, but it might be affecting a tissue that affected the nerve that went to your mouth, and so that you were not getting the same response as you normally would. And it also might actually feed to the cell more responses so that the cell would fatigue. In other words, for example, if you've got diabetes and you have sugar in your bloodstream, that's another organ where the sugar is being released from the liver and so forth, but it then will come and affect the receptor for sweetness, and if it's carried on long enough, you will have less sensitivity to sweetness. I sat next to a lady last night before the faculty research lecture who is a true diabetic, and she is quite insensitive to sweetness now. It's the first time I'd actually seen one in the flesh. I've read about it in the literature, and so even though she knew it was awful for her, it was a big night for her, and she was going to have sugar last night and take insulin all day today. That's the way she was going to get around that problem. So she had her sweet taste last night, even though she had more sweetness than she really should have had. And the last way that nutrition could modify sensory response might be that there was some change in the molecular structure of the receptor due to nutritional deficiency. That is, the surface of the receptor could change. Now, this is a very attractive theory if we knew what the surface of the receptor was. But except for the possibility we might know for sweetness now, we're rather lost to know what the receptor surfaces are like. But if the nutrition caused the receptor surface to be different, it might be more sensitive or it might be less sensitive. Or it might not be sensitive at all. You might just go taste blind for a given thing. I think this is a field that will become more important in the future. As we know more about nutritional diseases, we will then be looking for changes in their sensory response, and this may work the other direction then. People who are looking for nutritional deficiencies may test people for their sensory responses as a clue to which nutritional disease they actually have. And there is a man working in Ohio who's based his whole career on this thing. He finds that people are hypersensitive to this, and that means that in this particular compound that they have some childish disease or some nervous condition or something, and that reinforces his diagnosis of the case. So this could be important in medicine as well as important in sensory evaluation. Now, what does stress do? This is a question that we ask ourselves all the time. And how does it operate? We all know that it's very bad to go into sensory situations where evaluation of foods when you're under stress. As a matter of fact, it's been studied with war, people that are under stress from wars, people under stress from driving, pilots that are under high stress. There's a lot of literature on this. And I think that we probably haven't given enough attention. I remember when Mr. Filippella was doing all the sensory evaluation in this building. It was a time when I was terribly busy, or at least I thought I was busy, with a lot of research and a lot of teaching. And I remember I would run over at 5 minutes to 12 and rush through the test in a great hurry. And I'm sure my results suffered from that. I was under a great deal of stress at that time. It could affect the flavor. Stress could affect the flavor, either by making you more sensitive or making you less sensitive. I think in general that it makes you less sensitive. But there could be cases where it made you more sensitive, and there's some indication of that in the literature. It also, when you're under stress, your motor phenomena change. That is, your digestive tract changes. The contractions of your stomach the contractions of your small intestine. Whether any of you have colitis or not, or know what contraction of the small intestine is, but when you get terribly nervous, your girlfriend has told you to go and hang your hat on another tree, and you can't go to sleep then because you've got all these tensions. Well, these are all reactions that might affect taste in one way or the other. Even peristalsis is affected by this. The flow of the gastric juices can be increased and decreased by the amount of stress that you're under. And stress includes not only emotional stresses and nervous stresses, but also includes stresses having to do with shock, battle victims and so forth, which are under terrible stress. These all might change the sensitivity to foods. There's also the possibility that when you're under stress, the body fluids in general change somewhat. This feeds into the hypothalamus, which is an area up in top of your head here, which controls food intake, controls hunger, controls appetite, and these are certainly related, as I'm going to point out in just a moment, to the sensory response that people give to foods. So that this higher nervous system control of hunger and appetite when people are under stress may also operate to influence their intake of foods or their reaction to foods. I'm going to take up the part at the top of page 2, what value do the senses have, next time, as a part of the general senses thing. I want to say just a few words now about factors influencing food habits, because these in turn cause people to reject certain foods in a sensory situation and cause people to accept them. It'd be awful if you had a wine panel and all 10 people on the wine panel were practicing Muslims. We wouldn't get very far in our work. We have all kinds of cultural patterns. Some of you have had this Pangborn's food course or food science in Tech 1, and you know how many of these different kind of patterns there are. People also have different patterns depending on their income and their social status. I've said this many times before. When your income is low, you don't buy canned pears. And you can demonstrate this by any food market survey. You buy more flour, you buy more beans, you buy more things of that kind. In our emotions and anxiety, we've just been talking about that. We change what we're eating. If you're out of a job and you're worried about getting a job, it's not true that you lose weight. Most people gain weight under those situations. A very famous scientist here on the Davis campus who at one time, early in her career, was out of a job, and she gained about 60 pounds at that particular time. Just because there was no jobs available in 1933 and 34. Climate affects our food habits and therefore our preferences for food. A nice hot day in Davis wouldn't be a very good day to be testing hot tea blends or hot coffee blends for people. Or on some nice, cold, foggy day in the wintertime might not be the best time to be testing iced tea or iced coffee or even ice cream types of things. And then, of course, all the different things that have methods of preparation and serving. Many of us would be glad to participate in tastings that involve curry. But I'm sure there's a number of people in this room that even the thought of having curry or ginger or something would make you impossible to judge the foods. And you wouldn't be useful for the panels at all, because they wouldn't be useful for you. Well, the other things have to do with the difference between food preferences, food choices, and food habits. Food preferences are the particular foods that an individual likes or dislikes. Food preference is what you like or dislike. Your food choice is what you select at any one time. You may not prefer anything in the food line at the dormitories, but you still may make some choices. You may eat some things, otherwise you're going to starve to death, or you're going to be patronizing Safeway or something like that. The food habit is the sum of our food choices. All the things that go to become our food choices is our food habits. Now, is there a self-regulatory mechanism? Well, it would be interesting to know if there was a self-regulatory mechanism. If you just turn people loose, will they pick all the things that are going to feed them and make them happy and reproduce and enjoy life and so forth, live to be an old man and so forth? Or will they not? Are there genetic factors and other factors which influence our intake of foods, emotional factors and so forth, that will not permit us to have a self-regulating mechanism? First of all, it's pretty hard to have a self-regulating mechanism unless you're a rat. A rat in a good, well-endowed physiological laboratory. That's about the best place to have a completely self-regulatory diet. And rats will regulate their diet fairly well. They won't eat too much fat and get cirrhosis of the liver like human beings do. They will get the proper choice of vitamins more or less. Human beings are not rats, however. Human beings, in spite of the fact they act like it sometimes, human beings are influenced by their food habits, as I've just pointed out, by influence of stress on their reactions, availability of food's a big problem, the climatic influences and all these things. It's true that when we're hungry, we do seem to be more sensitive in general, quote, unquote, now, there's not very good proof on this. We do seem to be more excited by food, let's put it that way, not sensitive to food, we're more excited by food. If you've ever watched a really hungry child eating, takes the food down in great gulps to get rid of the hunger pangs and so forth. This may be different. Hunger may be different, is different than appetite. Hunger is those things that go like this. Appetite is something that you think about up here. How I would love to have that chocolate milkshake that Amerine talked about 10 minutes ago. Some of you probably already got your 55 cents out and ready to go downtown and get one. Well, anyway, those do influence the self-regulatory mechanism. Monotony influences the self-regulatory mechanism. Rats will eat the same grain day after day. Never complain, get fat, have big litters, and so forth. You just try and give American children cream of wheat every day or spinach every day. You can probably make up a diet that they would starve to death on right before they would eat it. And these also affect their responses to sensory evaluation situations. So this particular material I've been giving right in here now has tangentially to do with the sensory experience. I'll pick up next time with the literature. We'll start with the literature. We'll do the material on what value do the senses have, and there will be another outline next time in which I will talk just about the senses. I'm telling Mrs. Pangborn now that I'm also going to pick up the general material on speed of reaction for taste and odor and put it all in that lecture next time. So this will save you some time later on. And I may put a couple of other things together. I'll give you an outline of it so that we'll be talking, when we talk about taste on next Tuesday, and when we talk about odor on next Thursday, we will be talking about the senses in stricto, just about that particular sense as vis-a-vis the sensory evaluation of foods. Now, all those who do not have their name on this list need to go down to Laurie, who's at the end of the hall, who's waiting for you there now, and get an add slip or subtract slip if you need one. If you didn't give me your name, you can look at it here. Anything else, Ms. Penguin? Okay, that's all.